Elliot Lake was a wilderness in northern Ontario, surrounded by lakes and forests and inhabited by bear and deer and moose. Then in 1949, uranium was discovered. Elliot Lake was sitting on the largest known deposit of uranium ore in North America. And uranium was the fuel of the future. In 1955, the first mine was opened, with 10 more opening shortly after. Miners came to Elliot Lake from all over the world. Roads were built, homes constructed, and businesses opened. The population grew to over 30,000 people, and the town of Elliot Lake was born. But by 1958, the bottom fell out of the uranium industry. Contracts were canceled, the miners left. Homes were boarded up, and businesses closed. Only 2 mines remained open. Elliot Lake became a modern ghost town. But then by the early 1970s, the 2 remaining mines, Rio Algam and Denison, announced that new contracts had been signed with international markets. The town began to prosper again. But this time, there was a difference. Many of the miners from the 1950s were now sick. They had difficulty breathing. Some had developed lung cancer. And there was a growing awareness among the miners that in order to work, their health was being sacrificed to the mining companies. And that fact was simply unacceptable.
When you come out from underground, you spit that black stuff, I don't know what was in it, but you don't swallow it back, you just spit it out. Even in a vacation, 2 weeks after you left the mines, you still were spitting that black, maybe diesel smoke and dust and oil and whatever was in it.
Around 72, 73, when I used to go home from work and feel really tired and exhausted and really didn't feel good. I knew that I didn't feel like I should have felt after a day's work on the ground.
When you was changing from your street clothes to your work clothes, which took on average 10, 15 minutes, in that room they were injected aluminum oxide dust, which the worker breathed unless you hold your breath for 15 minutes. We was told that that is to prevent silicosis.
So they said you really breathe deep, when you go to that black. Everything was black. You touched the walls and your fingers got black right away because it was that aluminum dust.
But we were very ignorant of those aspects of our working conditions. Let me say that we were deliberately kept ignorant.
It was mandatory that miners took yearly chest x-rays to show whether they were developing silicosis, a disease of the lungs caused by working in mines. Most miners got a clean bill of health by the Compensation Board. But despite the results, some miners felt ill and began to suspect something was wrong.
These people became concerned because they knew themselves, they knew their own bodies, and several of them went out of the country to have a medical examination. And those medical examinations on those individuals showed that they was silicotic, some of them 35% silicotic. A person doesn't become 35% silicotic from one annual X-ray to the next. It's a slow, progressive deterioration of the lungs, and it starts to show up on X-ray.
Milan Rocky had been a miner in Elliot Lake for 8 years. When he was only 50 years old, he developed a serious lung disease. He died 5 years later.
And I felt that, something changed in his lungs when he was at Elliot Lake for this to happen now. Since he had never been sick in his life with anything until then.
Joe died and left a young family at a very young age, and he was a really good guy, and a guy who said, in the early days, that'll never happen to me. We never believed that these things would happen until we actually started to see our fellow workers actually been recipients of that horrible disease.
The Compensation Board refused to acknowledge that lung cancer and other related lung disease were caused by the mines. So when the miners, too sick to work, applied for compensation, their requests were denied. John Gretel was a miner in Elliot Lake for 2 years. At age 56, he developed cancer and died shortly after.
My mother was completely devastated. She was so afraid. She was 53. She did not speak the language that well. She worked as a cleaning lady for less than minimum wage. And she thought, oh, what am I going to do, you know? And I have this daughter, and how am I going to get her through school? How am I going to raise her? What if something happens to me? All these questions, like, over and over.
The workers, the rank and file, started to become involved, and we all was asking questions about radiation. The word that you don't mention. We were starting to raise those issues, even though the company was still at that attitude that they believed that they had control of it, it had nothing to do with you. Like, we contracted ourselves to work 40 hours a week. We didn't contract our lives in that arrangement.
The miners grew more and more frustrated with the company's unwillingness to do anything about these problems. And this anger finally erupted into their first wildcat strike over health and safety.
What happened on April the 18th in 1974, that was the climax of all those frustrations, and those frustrations went on for several years. It came to a bubbling point. That wildcat strike wasn't planned. It was a membership meeting. It was the afternoon meeting, which was our regular membership meeting. Those issues was being raised. We wasn't getting answers. And the members attending that meeting left the meeting and put up a picket line. Into the first 10 days of that 2-week strike, the company wouldn't even sit down with the local unions. It had never happened before. It had never happened where the primary concerns was health and safety, that workers were refusing to go to work because of the issue of health and safety and those other issues and those other frustrations. That had never happened before.
Paul Falkowski, an environmental representative for the Steelworkers Union, was asked to go to Elliot Lake to help the miners in their struggle. And he arrived the day the strike began.
I went now to the picket line to find out what was going on. The men at the picket line were very angry. We had a meeting in the union hall the next day after I went to the picket line, and we formed a committee of 12 people. Then we looked at the physical violations of the Mining Act within about 2 hours from the people that were in the union hall at that time. I noted 64 violations of the Mining Act.
Legal standards for safety were set in place for all operating mines in the province of Ontario. Denison Mines was delinquent in meeting most of those standards.
We asked for a meeting with the king of Elliot Lake, Mr. Mario de Bastiani, the manager of Denison Mines. After I outlined the conditions in the mine to him, I said to him, from the environmental conditions known to you as the mines manager, and the way the people are suffering, this is equal of you personally killing these people.
I don't believe one worker should lose his life to make a profit for some damn company. I don't care which company.
Eli Martell was tenacious. He challenged the provincial government to take action, to do something to help the Elliot Lake miners.
And the name of the game was deny it. And I'm saying that in 1962, the Ministry of Mines warned in its own annual report of the imminent danger if workers were exposed to uranium, and most of them were exposed beyond the safe limit. And by 1974, no one, but no one, had in fact moved in on it.
The union came behind us 100%. The politicians in opposition came behind us. In the New Democratic Party, Eli Martel, which was the critic in health and safety, Stephen Lewis, who was leader at the time, all those things came together.
You see that people are dying because of their jobs. You see that the companies don't care, the government doesn't care, the doctors who are employed by the companies don't care, the Workers' Compensation Board doesn't care. What are you supposed to do?
The struggle for safety of the Elliot Lake miners became a personal fight for Stephen Lewis, who was then the leader of the Ontario New Democratic Party.
Nothing ever made me angrier in my political life than what was done to the workers of Elliot Lake.
I listened to their plight. I listened to the wives tell me about how they were just exhausted. I mean, they were ill, terribly ill. And the tragedy is the government knew. We didn't. The workers didn't. The union didn't. And certainly the legislature didn't know. But I want to tell you, there were people in Ontario who knew.
The union knew that there was a relationship between uranium mining and lung disease, but they needed to prove it. So they asked the provincial government if they had ever conducted research which showed the effects of uranium mining on workers' health. The government claimed that no such study has ever been done. Shortly after, Paul left for Bordeaux, France, to attend an international symposium on radiation protection. And on the second day there, the Ontario Ministry of Health gave a presentation that documented the effects of uranium mining on the workers at Elliot Lake.
There we are in Bordeaux, France, picking up a study that was studied in Elliot Lake, and we were told here, Stephen was told, Eli was told by the government, that there was no study available. And their study was presented at the International Symposium.
Two local union presidents at the time and Paul Falkowski went to Bordeaux, France, at a symposium. It was called The Hazards of Mining Uranium, an international symposium. 26, 28 countries participated. To come back with a study that was presented at that conference from the Ministry of Health Ontario, Jan Mueller was the author of that study, to show that 41 of us had died, compared to the general population where only 13 should have died of lung cancer. We wasn't even aware we were being studied.
So you get this bizarre business of using Elliot Lake as a laboratory to show the damage caused by working in uranium mines, to receive sort of accolades by your international colleagues who are doing the studies, and never to tell the workers.
They deliberately kept us ignorant. There's no other way to describe it. Government has a responsibility, and in this case, they failed to keep the workers advised. They failed to warn the workers of their work environment, and they was part of that conspiracy.
I just don't know what accounts for the behavior collectively. It comes as close to giving meaning to the word evil as you will find in the political process, because this capacity to sacrifice workers' lives for the sake of maintaining the company's profit and dominance is beyond moral defensibility.
Shortly after the conference in France, Paul had a heart attack. He had to leave Elliot Lake for medical treatment in Sudbury.
Lynn, who was the district director, searched now for somebody to go in and tell you to carry on that fight, because the fight wasn't over. Now Lynn looked around and he found a fellow in Sudbury by the name of Homer Seguin.
Homer Seguin started working at Inco's sintering plant in the Sudbury area when he was 16. He had seen his fellow workers get sick and slowly die from the filthy conditions around them. He knew then that his life's work would be fighting for the rights of working people.
We knew people were dying. Workers were dying because we could count the bodies now. They were starting to add up, the lung cancer victims, the white finger victims, the silicotic victims. They were coming upon us. And in 74 they started, but in 75 they were really coming. And people were talking about their friends and all of these things. So you knew you had to do something about it.
Finally, what came out of that strike, because it did attract national media attention, it attracted the politicians. Again, I think that was the climax of a campaign which had been going on in the labor movement, and especially in the Steelworkers Union, that the slaughter of workers in the various industrial sectors had to stop, that there had to be legislation, there had to be reform in legislation, where workers would have some rights in the workplace.
Because of the determination of the Elliot Lake miners, and with the help of the Ontario New Democratic Party, in October of 1974, the Ontario government announced that there would be a royal commission to investigate the health and safety of mines in Ontario. The commission was led by Dr. James Ham, an engineering professor in Toronto. It was the first time in history that the Ontario government had commissioned an inquiry into the safety practices of the mines.
And we did get new legislation. We got a new Occupational Health and Safety Act as a result of Ham's report and continuing lobbying of the union and of the New Democratic Party in Parliament. And a fine new act was born. But guess what? It didn't apply to the workers of Elliot Lake.
2 weeks after the 1978 Ontario Occupational Health and Safety Act was announced, the federal government stepped in and claimed that the uranium miners fell under federal jurisdiction. The new legislation did not apply to the Elliot Lake miners.
The tragedy of Elliot Lake, of course, is once we got occupational health, the federal government, of course, those wonderful liberals, they sat and kept the uranium miners under the health and safety legislation at the federal level, which was far inferior, far inferior to the new provincial legislation.
And so we were elated when the act came, but then when we learned it didn't apply to us in Elliot Lake, the people that had fought and got the Ham Commission, and we were being left out, it was unbelievable. But when the shock died down, we were determined to do something about it. And if we couldn't rely on the government to look after our health and safety, we were going to have to do it ourselves.
Some people called us radicals and this and that, and we was all over the place, and we went after the company and anyone else to get answers. What Homer did when he came to Elliot Lake, he could see that commitment there in many of us, and he organized that energy into a more meaningful approach with regards to the health hazards associated with radiation, etc. Homer was as ignorant